Hello everyone. Today we're talking about Booker T. Washington and how his racial accommodation theory shaped the race relations in the United States at the turn of the 20th century. Right? Uh, I always find the topic of Booker T. Washington interesting because uh, Martin Luther King Jr. is such a enormous figure in American history that he tends to overshadow Booker T. Washington quite a bit, right? Um, One of the best ways to understand Booker T. Washington is that we don't have a Martin Luther King Jr. without Booker T. Washington, all right? Booker T. Washington is by far the most influential Black American at the turn of the century of the 1900s. His work, his racial accommodation theory, the Atlanta speech, really changed the relations and it really set the tone for the future of the civil rights movement in the 1950s. Right? Today I want to talk about the significance of Booker T. Washington, and let's get started. All right, so to understand Booker T. Washington, we need to understand them within the context of his time, right? So Booker T. Washington rises to prominence post Reconstruction, basically because the Reconstruction initially, particularly during Congressional Reconstruction, it had set this tone for progress for a lot of Black Americans to feel like they were finally going to be integrated into the American society. However, by the end of the Reconstruction, it all came crashing down, right? So we do have the rise of this new South, and although this new South is trying to move away from this old South, this antebellum South that highly relied on, on slavery, agriculture, and is trying to move, into a more industrial, more modernized South, it is also doubling down on the racial policies, right? The South does not understand itself in a equal society between whites and blacks. All right, so the southern states are instituting segregationist policies, kind of informal. Uh, it's mainly as a way to regain control post Reconstruction, right? But everything is gonna change in 1896, with the court case of Plessy versus Ferguson, right? So although segregation was kind of like informal, after Plessy versus Ferguson, it wasn't just a social custom, it became the law of the land, right? Because although uh, people in the South use segregation as a way of coexist, as a way of understanding this new reality between blacks and whites, Plaster Ferguson basically says it is okay to segregate, all right? It is okay to segregate as long as it's separate but equal, right? Uh, every hope that Black Americans had of integration, of finally being part of the American society, it's destroyed with the court case of Placer versus Ferguson, because now the court case is saying you can segregate, you can separate by race if you want to, as long as it's separate but equal. The unfortunate part of it is that we know it's going to be separate, but it's not going to be equal. So very soon, shortly after, we're going to see that this segregation of policies are going to permeate every aspect of life in the South, right? It can go from the very small, for like water fountains, parks, to hospitals. So it can be in every aspect of life, right? Water fountains, hospitals, cemeteries, park benches, transportations, restaurants. It is legal to segregate, right? It is legally enforced. Okay, so this is going to really change the dynamics of the southern United States, at the turn of the century. So to understand this Jim Crow South, it is impossible to understand it without the idea of segregation, this whole Plessy versus Ferguson, separate but equal, but also without legal barriers, right? So, what are legal barriers, right? You can understand legal barriers as a loophole around the 15th Amendment, right? So, what they're doing in some of the southern states is basically saying, I'm not denying the right to vote. You have the right to vote. However, you know, everyone needs to pass this literacy test, right? And this literacy test, sometimes there was one for white people and there was one for black people, right? As you can expect, one is easier than the other, right? There was also the idea of poll taxes, right? That they would, of course, target more black people because at the turn of the century, black people were the ones who were the most disenfranchised, right? After so many years of slavery, Reconstruction, and all different things, they are the group who are least likely to want to pay a poll tax, right? And if all this is not enough, there's also this grandfather clause, right? So this grandfather clause is basically saying if one of your grandparents had the right to vote during pre-Civil War, then you don't have to pay a you don't have to do the poll tax or the literacy test, right? So these are basically ways to stop black people from voting. The goal was we need to stop black people from voting because in the United States the best way to achieve change is through voting, right? So the idea was we want to stop this very specific group from voting so they cannot vote for laws that would benefit them, right? So we can put the people we want back in power, right? So, legal barriers, segregation, and the other very significant one is going to be lynchings and violence, right? So, um, lynchings are, you know, are ways of kind of like vigilante justice as it was used in the South, and about 4,400 people were lynched between the 1880s until the 1950s, right? So lynchings were basically mob justice, right? So if someone had broken social customs in the South, you know, dating white women, for example, competing for jobs, not adhering to the social customs of the time, you can get in trouble. But not only, any trouble, but you could get into lynchings, right? And, lynchings were ways to, demonstrate the power one group of people had over the other, right? So this was the Jim Crow South in which Booker T. Washington, you know, rose to prominence, right? So on this context of this Jim Crow South and this horrible, terrible circumstances that, is emerging, that is kind of like the promise of equality is not being fulfilled. This is where Booker T. Washington rises to prominence, right? So how is Booker T. Washington rising to prominence during this time? All right, so the best way to understand Booker T. Washington is that he was a pragmatist. What does this mean? It means that Booker T. Washington had this philosophy that aimed to navigate these harsh realities of life rather than fight these harsh realities of life. Okay, so what Booker T. Washington was thinking is that rather than fighting for equality, how can we become better within these difficult conditions that we're living under? Okay, so he's willing to trade this civil rights. He's willing to accept injustice, to accept segregation, to accept this, horrible conditions that I just talked about in exchange for gradual progress, right? So we're not looking to get better tomorrow, today. We're going to, for now, focus on economic independence. We're going to focus now on getting an education. So within the scope of this horrible situation that we're living, we can still get an education. We can still get a job and become economically independent. And gradually we can achieve this equality that was promised post Civil War. And so Booker T. Washington believed this was the best way to equip Black Americans to survive these harsh realities, right? His goal was to create a generation of self-sufficient Black Americans that could eventually achieve full equality, right? So his work can be best summarized by the Tuskegee Institute. So the Tuskegee Institute is this school for Black Americans where you could go there and you could learn practical skills, right? Something of value for the labor force, right? Something that could give you more value in society, right? So he kind of emphasized the idea of trades and vocational jobs, right? Something that, in other words, he's not looking for the liberal arts. He's looking more for, how can you become productive and how can you become a valuable member where people want your skills in the labor force, right? So the Tuskegee Institute was founded by Booker T. Washington, 1881, and it was free education for Black Americans, and this is where you can see his philosophy at work. So Booker T. Washington's philosophies can be best summarized in the Atlanta speech, right? So the Atlanta speech is a presentation that Booker T. Washington gave at the Cotton State and the International Exposition, right? So here Booker T. Washington talked to a mostly predominant white audience, and here he delineated the plan for Black America for the coming generations, right? So it can best be summarized by 4 points. And the first one is not looking for immediate equality, right? It was more of a gradual equality, right? So one of the things that, the reason Booker T. Washington is considered a pragmatist is because he kind of understands that immediate equality within the context of his time, it was going to be very difficult to achieve. But a gradual equality was something that it was going to be easier for a white audience to accept, right? It was going to ease them of their fears of the intermingling of the races, right? So Booker T. Washington is delineating this idea of gradual equality as opposed to immediate equality. So the second point is accepting temporary segregation and disenfranchisement in exchange for economic independence, right? So the idea is we're going to accept this racial injustice. We're going to accept the society that you're putting us under, but in exchange, we want to be able to become economically independent, right? In a way, it's kind of like leave us alone, right? Let us, develop economically. Let us develop educationally. Let us become, what we want to be. We're going to leave you alone. We're going to accept segregation. You don't need to fear this intermingling, but leave us alone so we can develop better economically and educationally. All right. The third point is vocational training and self improvement to achieve economic independence, right? So, this third point is basically the idea of we're not going to focus on studying the liberal arts. We're not going to focus on any of these fancy diplomas. What we're going to focus on is trades, agriculture, uh, craftsmanships, anything that could be valued in society at the time. All right, so we're not going to go for this diploma so we can go into the labor force, and going into politics. We're not going to want to intermingle with you in that sense. We're going to become better in trades, all right, in craftsmanships, right, vocational trainings. All right, guys. So the fourth point is cooperation and racial harmony, right? So the best way to understand this is that Booker T. Washington sees this as we may be segregated, but we're still part of the same society. So it is on the best interest of everyone that we all do our best, right? That white people do better, but that also that black people do better, right? It is in the best interest of white people that black people rise above and overcome, right? That they get fully integrated into society as equal members, right? And all of this can be best summarized by the very famous phrase of the Atlanta speech, right? Booker T. Washington says, in all things that are purely social, we can be as separate as the finger, yet as one as the hand in all things that are essential to the mutual progress. So given the violent suppression of black rights and all this, horrible circumstances that I talked earlier, guys, Booker T. Washington saw accommodation as the safest way to achieve equality, right? A gradual equality. So his philosophy really did transform the lives of many Americans, right? Within the context of the horrible societies that black Americans experienced, they were able to be better. right? They were able to, to achieve this economic independence. And it is important to note that Booker T. Washington didn't understand this as a permanent solution, right? It was a temporary acceptance of all the situation in order to achieve gradual equality. So in 1905, we're also going to see the emergence of W.B. Du Bois, who at first he becomes, you know, an admirer of Booker T. Washington. He's on board with the idea of this accommodation. However, with time, he becomes one of this, most harshest critics of the philosophy, right? Because at the end of the day, the way W.B. Du Bois understands this is that, injustice needs to be fought, right? Injustice cannot be accepted because you're going to set the tone for future generations to always accept inequality, to never fight for what is right, right? So as you can see, Booker T. Washington is going to be controversial. However, it is important to note that Booker T. Washington is going to be the most influential, the most important, the most famous, the most everything, the most important Black American in the United States at the turn of the 20th century is Booker T. Washington, right? He's going to be an advisor to Teddy Roosevelt, to William Howard Taft. He's going to play a role in American politics. you know he's the most recognizable figure, he's the most respected figure. His policies all the way until you know the end of World War I is what really became the standard for race relations in the United States, right? Now it is not without criticism, of course, which is this idea of W. Du Bois, okay, of you need to fight injustice, right? You need to fight this ideas of inequality. You cannot just accept it and look for an accommodation way out, right? So I think today, Booker T. Washington, a lot of people don't like his ideas because they don't make sense in present times. However, to understand Booker T. Washington and his importance, you need to think about it in within the context of when he lived, right? He's not a man of the modern times. He's a man of the turn of the 20th century when life was very different in a way that it's impossible for us to understand. Even though it's not too long ago, it is impossible for us to understand how difficult the situation, the 1890s United States, the early 1900s United States, he's looking for the best solution for, improving race relations. And at the same time, to look for what is better for his own people, right? So Booker T. Washington is not a man that exists in a vacuum. He's a man of his time, right? And it's very understandably that people criticize his politics, right? However, historical context is always very important for understanding Booker T. Washington, because at the end of the day, progress was achieved, tremendous progress was achieved through Booker T. Washington. However, it is also important to understand that the progress that was going to be achieved through Booker T. Washington was never going to be 100% progress. You're never going to be able to achieve full equality under that premise. And this is where we're going to see the emergence of Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and all those other figures that we see in the 1950s. But in a way, it's important to understand that we don't have an MLK, we don't have a Malcolm X without the groundwork of Booker T. Washington. Okay, so anyways, guys, so let me know, what do you think should be the legacy of Booker T. Washington, all right? Is he the man who laid the groundwork for MLK and the civil rights movement, or was he wrong in his approach of accommodation? All right, I don't want to take much more of your time. I'll be around, and I'll see you guys. Okay.